Yeah.
The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those knuckleheads of liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
It is March 6, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we are bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the country and in your region. And today we have a special guest, Walter Block. He is a professor of economics at Loyola University. He is the Harold E. Eminent Scholar Chair in economics there, and he is a well-known figure within the libertarian community. And James, maybe I could get the visual real quick. You can certainly go find more information about him here at Mises Institute. He has tons of stuff there. You'll know him from great books like Defending the Undefendable 2, and just ridiculous amount of stuff. So we're blessed to have him on the show today. But before we get into the show, let me introduce you to the rest of the panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In our upper right-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. In our lower left-hand corner right now, we have Walter Block with us. And I think today, Leon, he is the last word in liberty. So we'll give him that. We'll give him that. But Walter, we're just blessed to have you on the show today, as I mentioned before. And we'd love to talk to you about sort of, I guess, your evolution, how you became a libertarian. That's one of the things we always like to talk with our guests about. So people who are sitting out there watching can kind of see if this sort of jives with them and maybe how they can get involved. So Walter, when did you first discover a value for liberty?
Well, I'm Jewish and I'm from Brooklyn, which means pretty much I'm a pinko, commie, liberal, progressive, whatever it is. I was a friend of Bernie Sanders. He and I were on the track team in high school together, and I had roughly the same views as he did. And then I was at Brooklyn College, and I was still a lefty Democrat type. And Ayn Rand came to lecture at Brooklyn College, and I came to boo and hiss her because she favored free enterprise. And everyone knows that economic freedom is fascism. In those days, you boo and hiss politely. You don't cancel them. You don't try to stop them from speaking. This was, maybe 1963 or so. And afterward, I didn't get enough booing and hissing because they announced that the Ayn Rand Study Club that had invited her was having a lunch in her honor, and anyone would be welcome, even if you disagreed. And I wanted to convert her to socialism, so I went to the lunch. And there was this long, long table. She was sitting at the head of it, and all of her buddies, chief lieutenants, Alan Greenspan, Leonard Peikoff, all of her buddies were sitting there, and there was no room at that end of the table. So I sat at the other end, and I approached my neighbor and tried to convert him to socialism. And he said, well, he didn't know that much about it, but the people who did were at the other end of the table. So I stuck my head in between Ayn Rand and her chief lieutenant, and I said, there's a socialist who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And they said, who is it? I said, me. And I was, maybe 20 years old. And what happened was one of her chief lieutenants, Nathaniel Brandon, came to the other end of the table. He said, there's no room to sit here. We'll talk over there on two conditions. One, you don't allow this conversation to lapse until we settle it. And two, you read two books that I'll recommend. So I talked to him, and the two books were Economics in One Lesson and Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And I went to his house and to Ayn Rand's house a few times, and I was converted. I was now not a Randian. They were a little too cultish for my taste, but I was certainly a Randian on economics. I mean, they revered Ludwig von Mises, and Ludwig von Mises is, I don't know, next to God in terms of our firmament. So I was now a limited government libertarian.
Well, Walter, can I stop you just for a second there? Is that when you first decided that you were going to focus on economics, or did you kind of have that interest before you met the
Uh,
Randians?
Much later, I was a philosophy major, and I was an undergraduate. And then when I graduated school, I wanted to go to graduate school and I wanted to promote liberty. And it was a choice. Would economics be the best vehicle or philosophy? And I was unsure. So I enrolled in two master's programs. And each semester I would take three of one and two of the other, or two of one and three of the other, until I finally decided that economics was a much better vehicle to promote liberty. And I'm glad I did, because philosophy department is very hard for a free enterprise libertarian to get a job, because philosophy is just overrun with commies. Economics isn't quite so bad, so I'm glad I took that on a practical level, and I think also uh, I don't know what philosophical level, that economics is a better vehicle because you can get into things from economics that you can't get into from philosophy. And I guess my own predilection is I'm more philosophically oriented than economically oriented, despite the fact that I have a PhD in economics. I mean, most of my publications are more in philosophy and libertarianism than they are in economics. Although when I got to Loyola University, I fell under the sway of my friend Bill Barnett, who compelled me to write about economics. So I wrote quite a bit about that with him. But other than that, I'm more into libertarianism than I am into economics. But I still think economics is a better vehicle for promoting liberty than philosophy.
Hmm.
Why do you feel that way though? I could understand the need to inject economics into the promotion of libertarianism, but why philosophy, you think, does not
Well,
do the
I
job?
two reasons. One, I'm more philosophically oriented, so I don't need philosophy as much as I need economics. Economics is more of a strange subject to me personally. And secondly, there are a lot of things like business cycles, unemployment, things like that philosophy doesn't really prepare you for, but economics does, or market failures like externalities or pollution or things like that. I think economics, monopoly theory or antitrust theory, philosophy doesn't prepare you to do anything on that, whereas economics does. Whereas for me, the philosophical issues come easier. So it's part personal and part, I think, economics deals better with issues like, I don't know, why so many people are dying because they can't get a kidney transplant. Uh, Obviously, the reason is because you can't buy and sell kidneys. But philosophy isn't going to help you with that, whereas economics gives you a supply and demand curve and gives you more of a leg up.
I see.
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, that brings up a good question though, as far as your value as being a libertarian. Then, so is it more of a value in I guess the morality of having a voluntary society, or is it more of just the idea from the economics perspective that the socialism stuff really just doesn't work? I mean, the information problems embedded in socialism are just a disaster.
Well, I think each one is important. Each one is more important than the other. That's not right, but I think they're both important, and it's hard to figure out which is more important. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, it's the one, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, it's the other. Libertarianism will bring about better prosperity, and it's also the only just system. And which is more important? I suppose if I had to pick, the justice would be more important for me. Uh, Justice though the heavens fall. So even if libertarianism didn't bring prosperity, which it most certainly does, and socialism did, I would still favor capitalism because it's the just system. And for me, justice rings more strongly than mere prosperity.
Walter, today in society, I would say quite a lot of people are being seduced by the concept of socialism. And libertarian philosophy or free market enterprise philosophy or issues of property rights seem to be on a downslide. Why do you believe that the seduction of socialism is becoming so prominent in our society?
Well, if you plotted it, it sort of goes up and down, or you have a pendulum. We swing back and forth toward liberty and away from liberty. The way I'm a professor. I'm never supposed to answer any question. I have to make them up on my own. I'll translate your question as, why isn't Ron Paul president? Or why do we have so few libertarians? And I'm not so concerned about, this year it's a little bit more libertarian, next year a little less libertarian. Who knows? I don't really know. But I think a good theory as to why libertarianism is not popular at all. And the answer, I think, stems from sociobiology, which is the theory that we are the way we are now based upon what it took to live and give seed to the next generation a million years ago when we were in the caves or in the trees, when we were cavemen. And we lived in groups of 20, 30, 50 people tops. And there are two ways that we can cooperate with each other, implicitly or explicitly. And in the caveman days, explicitly was the only way. Implicitly is through markets. There were no markets when you lived in a group of 25 uncles and aunts and cousins. We got a deer and we shared the deer. And if you didn't share the deer, they'd kick you out of the tribe. And this week, if you're sick, I help you. Next week, I'm sick, you help me. Our tribe survives. So there's a big emphasis on helping each other. And look, if you're in a restaurant and somebody starts choking, you're not going to just continue with your meal. You're going to be very upset. And you're going to grab the guy and do the Heimlich maneuver, or you're going to call a doctor, or you're going to be very upset if somebody in the next booth is choking. And we're hardwired for that. But we're not hardwired to appreciate capitalism, because we didn't have any capitalism a million years ago when we were in the caves or in the trees. So I think the reason that it's sort of like the rock of Sisyphus, you push it up and it keeps coming back, you push it up, it keeps coming back. The reason there are so few libertarians, the reason Ron Paul is not president, or Rand Paul or somebody like that, the reason we don't have free enterprise is because we're fighting biology. We're fighting hardwiring. People are just not hardwired. I get freshman students in my classes at Loyola, and I mention price gouging, and they go, "Oh my God, price gouging! It's horrible." And I try to teach them well that, if you have Katrina and New Orleans is in trouble, you want prices to rise, because that would encourage people to bring stuff from Montana or wherever. And also, the first few people in the Walmart, without price gouging, they're going to grab up all the milk and all the orange juice because they're afraid. Whereas if the price of orange juice is 10 times as much as it used to be, then they're going to act more collegially, or more reasonably, more sensibly, and allow some orange juice for the people at the back of the line. So price gouging is a great thing, but I'm trying to overcome their biology. and sometimes I succeed, like Ayn Rand succeeded with me, and sometimes I succeed with my students, but it's an uphill battle. So to answer Leon's very good question, which I translated, not so much into this year versus last year or something like that, but why do we have such troubles as libertarians? I think that's a big, important part of the answer.
It is kind of ironic, though. You made that example of you're sitting in a restaurant and somebody's choking, and it seems like for a free person, your idea is, hey, so I better get up and help because if I don't, nobody else will. But it seems like with socialism, the government has almost made us less personal, where it's somebody else is choking, somebody call the government.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
I mean,
yeah,
it's like
good point. Good point. Yes.
so. Yeah, it's just. But one of the things you brought up the idea of people canceling, which is just terrible. What's going on nowadays? If they hear an idea they don't like, and I know I've heard a few stories about people trying to cancel you, and it seems terrible because you have such wonderful ideas and wonderful discussions. But the idea that people are trying to shut you down, could you tell us a little bit about some of these instances where people have tried to shut you down for some of the scholarly things you've said?
Well, I was doing an interview with the New York Times. This is around 2014 or maybe 2015, right before the 16 election. And I didn't realize what the idea that they had in mind. What it was Rand Paul, who was then a viable candidate for president, is a nut and we've got to smash him. And the thesis was, well, Rand Paul hangs around with a bunch of nuts, and here are a dozen nuts, and I was one of the nuts. And they were interviewing me as to, not anything about him, but, what's libertarianism? And they would try to get me in a gotcha statement. And then they would say, well, Rand Paul is an idiot because he hangs around with Walter, and don't vote for Rand. So I was trying to explain what libertarianism was, and I gave them the usual, the non-aggression and private property based on homesteading, and John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand and the usual stuff, and they just weren't getting it. And I came up with all sorts of examples, and they just weren't getting it. So I used the atom bomb. What's the atom bomb? The atom bomb is voluntary slavery. If my son, God forbid, has a horrible disease and it'll cost 50 million to cure him, and I don't have anything like 50 million, and one of you guys is very rich and you're willing to pay me 50 million to give to my son's doctors and save his life, now I become your slave. Is this a legitimate contract? And I would say yes. Anything between consenting adults is a legitimate contract. So I gave them that, and you know what they wrote about? They said I favored actual slavery. Actual slavery? No. You don't favor actual slavery. That was coercive. This is voluntary slavery. So these people, I don't want to use a harsher word, these people said I favored slavery. So the president of my university, he doesn't call me into his office and say, were you misquoted? Please tell me you were misquoted. He writes an essay saying, well, we're against slavery. Walter is favoring slavery. He's no good. And then, students start saying, well, I should be fired because, I favor slavery. We can't have me as a professor. So, look at the...
I'm sorry, Walter. I know it's a serious thing, but it sounds so hilarious. It's unbelievable. I'm very sorry.
It's very funny. I'm still laughing about it. The whole thing is ludicrous. Imagine a libertarian favoring actual slavery, and then this guy in a Reason magazine wrote a thing that block favors slavery. And then I was in a debate with him, and he wanted to shake my hand, and I said, well, he apologized. I said, well, you insulted me publicly. I'll shake your hand as soon as you publicly say that I don't favor slavery. And he never did. So I got into all sorts of trouble with people over this. On the other hand, then I had to sue them. I just had to sue the New York Times, but the problem is that I'm already on record on defending the undefendable. One, there are now 3 issues out there opposing libel laws. So, yes, they libeled me, but, according to libertarian theory, libel is free speech. And, they just ruined my reputation, but I don't own my reputation. My reputation consists of the thoughts of other people, and I don't own their thoughts. So they didn't steal anything from me, so I shouldn't be suing them. But I had to sue them, so I had to concoct something to justify this. And what I said was, well, they're in the ruling class. they're part of the government apparatus. They contribute to government, and that satisfied me. So I sued them, and we settled. I'm not supposed to say what the settlement was, but we did settle. And but still, that thing comes to haunt me. And now it's almost 10 years after 2014, and still people say, we won't have anything to do with you because you favor slavery. I sent an article to the Jewish Daily Forward on something totally different, and they rejected it on the grounds that I favor slavery. So, the New York Times has a long reach and a long geographical reach and a long time reach.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned. Oh, sorry, Tim. Were you trying to get in, or?
No, I'm just shaking my head in disbelief.
Yeah, I know the dishonesty of the sophistry of these people is just crazy. But it's funny. The thing you mentioned to just now of the idea that you have come down on the libertarian idea of, look, you don't own your reputation, and therefore you have an intellectual problem with suing them. I heard Ron Paul once. He was attacked on kind of a similar ground, not quite the same thing, but when he was in Congress, and he was being interviewed by Mike Wallace, and Mike Wallace said, "Hey, I noticed you get your people, your constituents, some of the best stuff in all of these, bills. You wind up getting them so much pork." And he said, "Well, I mean, I don't agree with what's happening, but if I'm going to be forced to play your game, I'm going to take advantage of the rules." Is essentially what he said. And it seems to me that you could certainly do exactly what you're saying there. If they're going to libel you and they're going to force you to play their game, you could certainly take advantage of their rules. So.
Another example of that would be only libertarians would have trouble working for the government, because government is, well, for the anarcho-capitalist, government is totally evil. But even for the limited government libertarian, they would have trouble working, say, for education, teaching in a public school, because according to limited government libertarianism, we ought to privatize all schools. So what are you doing working for a government school? And
yeah, well, I am one of those limited government conservative libertarian types, and I worked for the government for quite a long time, quite frankly. So
good. Well, I think you should work for the government, and you should be able to walk on the public streets and on the sidewalk, and going to a public library and going to a public park. We have Audubon Park in New Orleans, and I go there sometimes, and I don't feel badly about it, even though all parks should be privatized, even for limited government libertarians, conservative libertarians, not anarchist ones. Well, what's the justification for taking a salary from a public university? And I think that the justification is similar to what Ayn Rand wrote about Ragnar Daneskjöld, one of the characters in Atlas Shrugged, who attacked government ships and took the money and gave it back to people from whom the government had taken the money unjustifiably. But the point is that government for the anarcho-capitalist is a thief, and for the limited government libertarian, government is a thief when it exceeds its proper limited role.
yes.
Well, public education is exceeding its public role, so they stole money through taxes, and we're just getting it back. So it's justified to take money from a thief.
In the form of payment, salary.
Yeah, right. I mean, otherwise, how do I justify, or how does Ron Paul justify getting a salary when he was, or Rand Paul, when they were a member of Congress? They had a salary from government. Well, they were liberating money that was unjustifiably taken from taxpayers, would be the justification that I would use.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, one of the things too I wanted to ask you is, we just came through one of the most oppressive times, I think, in our country's history, this COVID thing, where they locked everybody down and just tried to essentially shut down discussion and debate. Anything that the government was saying, you weren't supposed to question it. And are you optimistic for the country's future? And also, what do you think the biggest threat to our liberty is going forward, given what we just went through with COVID?
Well, I'm not optimistic because I think we're fighting biology, as I mentioned before. I don't think we're going to win until maybe 100,000 years from now if we don't blow ourselves up, because it takes that long for biology to work its way out. And so I'm not optimistic. I'm a pessimist, but I still can't think of anything else I'd rather do than promote liberty. It's fun. It's exhilarating. It's marvelous. It's if you're religious, it's getting you closer to what God wants you to do, to promote liberty. So I'm not optimistic. I'm a big pessimist, but I'm cheery. I love what I'm doing, so I'm happy doing it, even though I don't think we're going to succeed. So the rock of Sisyphus, you push it up, it comes back, you keep pushing it up.
I guess if we're not going to push the rock, what else would we be doing?
But
getting crushed by the rock.
Yeah.
But don't you think in I mean on a more practical level, looking at what happened during the COVID pandemic, the lockdown of the schools, the lockdown of ourselves in our homes, and all that kind of stuff. Don't you think that? I mean, it probably feeds into your pessimism of our future. But don't you think it also exposed some of the rot that is in the system that really need to be rooted out, especially in, say, for instance, public education? Even though we have some issues with public education themselves, but don't you think it exposed some of it?
Well, my views on COVID are very different than most libertarian views on COVID. My views are very different. And I wrote an article, I think it was in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, where I blasted both the hawks and the doves. The hawks were the ones that said, you got to isolate, you got to wear a mask, you can't do this, you can't do that. The doves were saying it's all nonsense. It's just like a flu, and it only attacks people 75 years or older, and everyone else should go to work. And what I said is, we don't know. I wrote right at the beginning of the COVID thing. This was maybe 2020. And I said, we just don't know. And then I said, take the case of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary had typhoid. She was innocent. She didn't know she had typhoid, but she was working in a restaurant spreading typhoid, and typhoid is a dread disease. Well, if COVID was like that, then they would have been justified in doing not only what they did, but maybe even doing more. So I disagreed with all the libertarians who right out at the beginning said, well, the government is evil because the government is stopping people from spreading the disease, and it's not much of a disease. Well, if there were, they would have been justified in doing maybe even more than they did, because spreading a disease is a violation of the non-aggression principle. They were justified in taking Typhoid Mary, not putting her in jail, but isolating her and giving her food, putting her in a hotel, or maybe in her house, or whatever it would be. But you don't let Typhoid Mary out there. And now the thing about cancellation, I mean, if we want to cure cancer, or if we want to deal with COVID, or if we want to do anything, we have to have science. Well, one of the necessary, not sufficient, but necessary conditions of science is open-endedness, is debating. And if you shut off half the debate, you're not engaging in science. And they kept saying science, 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 and they kept threatening to take doctors' licenses away
Yes.
if they did anything other than what the rule was. Look, right now they're having a debate in astronomy: is Pluto a planet or not? What do I know? I'm not an astronomer. Whatever they decide, I'll go along with. But if the Pluto is a planet people were trying to put in jail the other people, then I would start agreeing with the other people, because I would think, well, if they really had the truth, they wouldn't have to do that. Yeah. So I think that it's the same thing with global warming. If the global warming people were correct, they wouldn't have to threaten the other people with jail sentences and loss of jobs and this and that and the other. So I don't look. I'm an economist. I'm not a weather person or anything like that. But I tend to disagree or disbelieve them, because my theory is that look, they could be right. But since I don't know about it, and one side is threatening the other side and not allowing science, I would then adhere to the other side, tentatively at least.
Walter, we've got to the end of our time. Sorry to say, it just flew like crazy with you, but we're going to have you on another show that other people can check out. So go check that out. We're going to be talking a deep dive on evictionism, which is libertarian ideas on abortion. So anyways, come check that out. And thanks so much, Walter, for joining us on this one. And we will see you at the next one. Until then, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.